Hello again, everyone. It's Alexander Platt here, your music director at the La Crosse Symphony Orchestra. And once again, it is my pleasure and privilege to say a few words about what is going to be a gorgeous and glorious program for you today. Before I continue, I want to thank once again our intrepid executive director, Eva Marie Restel, and our equally courageous board of directors in supporting me and the musicians of the orchestra in being able to bring to you live musical performances at this especially difficult time. The LSO is truly one of just a handful of orchestras all over the country that are continuing to present live performances, albeit, of course, in a completely safe and socially distanced manner. So whether today you're going to be sharing in this performance with us live, or in the modern miracle of live stream, I know this is going to be a program that you're going to find especially enjoyable and relevant. Now, of course, we're in the month of November, and November is the time at which all over the country we as orchestras have a venerable habit of celebrating our American heroes. Traditionally, of course, that celebration has been focused on those of our heroes who have served in foreign wars. This year, with the terrible crisis of the coronavirus amongst us, it is especially important that we remember those heroes in our midst, those heroes who are all around us every day in our community. Our first responders, our physicians, our surgeons, our nurses, our emergency workers, police, fire, and a myriad of other folks who all over this community and all over America are on the front lines of this vicious disease. But as you agree, I know we're going to get through this together, and La Crosse and the La Crosse Symphony Orchestra are such beautiful symbols of that community spirit. Therefore, we took great care and pleasure in putting together, with, of course, unfortunately not the full ranks of the La Crosse Symphony Orchestra, but with an especially treasurable group of just 15 of our musicians, a program that again would be enjoyable but also poignant and relevant to celebrating the heroes amongst us today. It is, of course, a program that consists entirely of American music, and specifically American music composed during the final years of World War II. A struggle not completely dissimilar to that we're all facing today with COVID-19, and that it has truly been, it was, as is now, a conflict that has brought and touched all of us at every stratum of our society. In that extraordinary struggle of World War II, we actually produced a lot of enduringly beautiful art and music. There's a familiar criticism that works of art that are created during tumultuous times often do not stand the test of time. It's works of, say, completely absolute music like, Mozart's Jupiter Symphony, that is just an example of a composer sitting down at a desk and writing a towering masterpiece. Those are the works that, best stand the test of time. When it comes to music written during the Second World War, however, there is really no end of masterpieces written by composers on both sides of the Atlantic. Here in America, we had a very gloriously diverse group of composers who were writing great American music. One of them was the quietly gifted genius of African American descent, Professor George Walker. We're going to start our concert today with what is indisputably his most famous work, a work written in 1945, 1946 called Lyric for Strings. This work, much like the Adagio for Strings of Samuel Barber, probably the most famous work of American music of all time, originally was written as the slow movement of a string quartet. It was written also while George Walker was a student at the legendary Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia, as Samuel Barber had been. So when in 1946, George Walker's fellow students and faculty heard this beautiful slow movement, which was originally titled by Professor Walker a lament, when they heard this beautiful slow movement from this beautiful string quartet, almost immediately George Walker was urged to turn that lament from that central movement from that string quartet into what would be the African American version of Barber's Adagio for Strings. Well, Walker quickly did this, and we have been the beneficiaries for many decades since, because in its own lyrical way, it hold its own alongside Samuel Barber's Adagio for Strings. It's a work, it couldn't be more different. It's a completely different spirit and a different tone, but it is an absolutely beautiful work, equally treasurable. This work gets played all over the world because it has, as you will soon experience, a very open-hearted and immediate appeal. Walker's sense of lyricism was something he carried throughout his long and distinguished career. He was not only the first African American to earn a doctorate from the Eastman School of Music, another of our very greatest music conservatories in America. He was also the first tenured faculty member at Smith College in Massachusetts, where he spent many years, and became part of that kind of grand, in the best sense of the word, that very grand Boston musical establishment. But his finest works were those in a lyrical mode. In fact, a song cycle called Lilacs after Walt Whitman was the work that earned him in 1996 the coveted Pulitzer Prize in Music. So Walker's Lyric for Strings, again written while he was just still a student, is the very beginning of that journey, which is one of the most enduringly successful careers in African American classical music to this day. George Walker died in 2018, again, a beloved figure in the Boston musical establishment, and it's my privilege to conduct for you what may well be the very first LSO performance of this beautiful little gem. Well, we go from Professor George Walker to one of the most, probably along with George Gershwin and Leonard Bernstein, the most famous of all American composers, Mr. Aaron Copeland, born with the 20th century in 1900 and who died at the age of 90 in the autumn of 1990, just very appropriately, just within days of the death of his former pupil and very, very dear friend, the equally towering American musical genius, Leonard Bernstein. The death of these two towering musical figures in our lives as American musicians and music lovers was a time I'll never forget. It's like how people remember where they were when they heard that President Kennedy had been assassinated. I was a student at Cambridge University, and upon hearing the death of Bernstein and Copeland, respectively, I was just stunned. And it's in a sense, I was afflicted with a sadness that never left me. I mean, only in the sense that I think from those moments, I knew that I had to have a calling to do everything I could to promote the music of American composers. And it's something I've tried to do throughout my career. We're going to present two of the very, very greatest works by Aaron Copeland, written in any medium, but we're very lucky that they were both not only written during the final stages of World War II, but were genuinely scored for a small chamber orchestra. His Clarinet Concerto from 1947, and to finish our program, sorry, forgive me, before that, one of his immortal ballet scores in its original version for 13 instruments from 1944, Appalachian Spring. Like all of Copeland's greatest works, and I also am, in this sense, am reminded of Aaron Copeland's British English musical contemporary, the great composer Benjamin Britten. Copeland's greatest works always seem to have been born of a spirit of collaboration. The Clarinet Concerto was a great example of this because it was written on commission from one of the other towering giants of American music at that time of the mid-20th century, the immortal jazz clarinetist, Mr. Benny Goodman. As World War II came to an end, Benny Goodman voiced an interest in wanting to also do some classical stuff, as they called it back then, long hair. I don't know how that began. I think it was in the 19th century. Classical musicians were all supposed to have long hair, so if you did classical, it was long hair. So Benny Goodman started playing, for example, the Mozart Clarinet Concerto with members of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and then he thought he would commission a concerto for himself, and he went very shrewdly to Aaron Copeland, and he could not have done better, because Copeland, for the commission fee of $2,000, Mr. Copeland gave Mr. Benny Goodman what is a clarinet concerto, honestly, in its own way, every bit as great as the Clarinet Concerto of Mozart. It's just in a completely different language, if you will. Copeland's musical style is ultimately very French. As the great, now late, great British composer and conductor Oliver Knussen said to me when I was that summer after Copeland and Bernstein had died. I was a conducting fellow at Tanglewood, the summer home of the Boston Symphony, and Oliver Knussen, who was then, did a wonderful job trying to fill the gap left by Copeland and Bernstein, who was a teacher and mentor to many of us. He said to me one day at the snack bar at lunch, he said, Copeland at heart is just a great French composer of ballet. It's like he's our, if Leonard Bernstein was our Gustav Mahler, if George Gershwin was our Mozart, taken from us all too soon, Copeland really is like our Debussy or our Maurice Ravel, the man who wrote Daphnis and Chloe. He really was at his very best writing kind of French, early 20th century French ballet scores. And I say that not only because we're doing one of his immortal ballets, I think the greatest of them all, Appalachian Spring, but it's not for nothing that soon after the premiere of the Clarinet Concerto by Benny Goodman, it was actually staged as a ballet by another of the giants of mid-century American culture, the choreographer Jerome Robbins, who a few years later would help create, some little musical called West Side Story, but that is another story. From the very beginning, you sense this very, very French transparency of textures, this very kind of, how the French love to paint in the open air, they call it the plein air style. It's very plein air. It's very open, transparent, simple in the best sense of the word, serene, clear, serene. And this Clarinet Concerto, which has a unique musical construction of basically two big movements. It's not in 3 movements or in 4, but it's in 2 movements with an incredible solo clarinet cadenza in between. The entire first movement, which is in this very simple A-B-A form, is again something that could have come out of a French ballet from the 1920s. And again, I say that as a compliment because Copeland, who had studied in Paris, like so many great American composers, writers, artists at that time, really took that style on. So just think of it again as this very open air, very French style with this languorous clarinet solo arching over the proceedings with the very subtle accompaniment of the string orchestra and harp. After that incredible cadenza for the solo clarinet, we then go into the finale, the second of these 2 giant movements, which is a rondo in which the orchestral piano makes itself suddenly very prominent. This is a very freewheeling rondo. You know, what a rondo is where you have one basic idea, but then you have these alternating episodes in between appearances. So if the first movement is like an A-B-A, the finale is like A-B-A-C-A. And the intervening materials, when you're not hearing the main theme, are of especially South American musical derivation. And this is because when Copeland was writing this piece in 1946-47, the war, of course, had just ended, and Copeland was serving as kind of an American musical ambassador down in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And wherever Copeland went, he quickly took on, as part of his style, the music of that country. He spent the early 20s, of course, in Paris and became, as I've said, very much a French ballet composer. In the 30s, he spent quite a lot of time in Mexico, actually fell in love with Mexico. Mexico City in the 1930s was quite a hopping place for all the arts, really. And so that experience in Mexico City resulted in some of his greatest works on Latin themes, like the tone poem El Salón Mexico. But then down in Rio de Janeiro, he was inspired by all that amazing popular music that he heard just in streets and in the cafes. That music very, very much found its way into the rambunctious finale of the Clarinet Concerto, which I know our own Josh Baker is going to brilliantly dispatch. Well, the other of the 3 great works of mid-century American music that we're going to present to you today is a work that has always been one of my very, very favorite pieces of music. I am reminded as I think about it and try to say something eloquent about it, that I actually had the privilege of ever so slightly getting to know Mr. Copeland in the final years of his life. Sadly, by the mid-1980s, which is when I met him, he was already in the throes of the Alzheimer's disease that would eventually end his life. So I don't wish to exaggerate. He probably had no idea who I was, but it had all happened because when I was an undergraduate at Yale, I was writing the program notes for the Yale Philharmonia. They're a very distinguished orchestra of the Graduate School of Music at Yale. And my work had come to the attention of the program annotator of the New York Philharmonic. And I was invited to New York, and I was invited to some concerts. And eventually, Philip Ramey said, "How'd you like to meet Aaron Copeland?" So I did, and I actually sat in the what suffices for the Royal Box at Avery Fisher Hall at Lincoln Center, for it was a Friday afternoon concert, a Friday afternoon performance of, it was an all Copeland program that included his Clarinet Concerto, in which the solo part was played by the legendary and longtime principal clarinet of the New York Philharmonic, Stanley Drucker. And I remember sitting in the box right next to Mr. Copeland for that performance. I also remember being taken up to some luncheon parties at his home up the Hudson River at Peekskill, and there just were some very poignant moments where he would try to talk about, again, some of his older friends and colleagues who by then had passed away, like, for example, Samuel Barber. But the music of Appalachian Spring always stirred in him at this time of his life, when again he was in the grips of Alzheimer's. He had this, suddenly on his face would come this sense of almost religious serenity. And I think if there is any work of Aaron Copeland, along with the Fanfare for the Common Man, that really reveals for us the soul of this great composer, it is Appalachian Spring. You know, in my travels, like for example, when I was a student at Cambridge, and I would of course, you know, get my backpack and travel on the continent, I remember visiting a professor of music, very distinguished professor of music, and his wife in Vienna. And the Viennese, I hate to break the news to you, but they generally don't have a very high opinion of American classical composers. But I'd given them as a housewarming gift, or sorry, as a gift that I gave them as a house guest, I meant to say, a beautiful new recording that had just been made as a compact disc of Copeland's Appalachian Spring and a few other pieces. And I'll never forget this very distinguished, somewhat haughty, but very distinguished Viennese music professor saying, "Well, that's it. You know, you Americans, that's Appalachian Spring. That's it. That is a masterwork." And it really is, in a sense, like the Beethoven Fifth Symphony of Copeland's output. I mean, he left us quite a few masterpieces. But again, it's very relevant that, you know, his very, very greatest works in large-scale forms, if you think about it, are ballets. Rodeo, or as it's sometimes called, Rodeo, that he composed for Agnes de Mille. Billy the Kid, probably, I mean, if there is a ballet on the level of, if there's an American ballet on the level of, say, Tchaikovsky's The Sleeping Beauty or Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, it's Billy the Kid. But in the same breath, I would say to you, the other immortal of those ballets is Appalachian Spring. In Appalachian Spring, Aaron Copland says something that, again, was built on earlier traditions. It does ultimately take a village to make a masterpiece. He draws on that great French Impressionist style, those spare, lean textures, that simplicity and serenity you get in the music of, say, Gabriel Fauré or Maurice Ravel. There's a very Stravinskyan sense of rhythm, actually, which makes it extremely difficult to conduct because the rhythmic patterns are very much like, say, the Rite of Spring, all these mixed meters, you know. There's some passages that are in 4/4, of course, but there's a lot of 2/8, 3/8, 5/8, 7/8, 6/8. So it's a real tutorial in stick technique. But ultimately, to be very serious, this work, like Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, is ultimately, as they say in Latin, sui generis. It is utterly original and of itself. Nothing like this, to be perfectly serious, nothing like Appalachian Spring had ever been composed before. And while this piece has had countless imitations, because with Appalachian Spring and, say, Fanfare for the Common Man, Copeland really kind of established this classical American style of serious music. This work, like the greatest novels of Ernest Hemingway, is one of those American masterpieces that has been, again, imitated on countless instances, but has never really been equaled. This was a work whose creation years were literally in the middle of the Second World War. It was in 1942 that, again, in one of these great, extraordinary collaborations that Copeland entered into with other equally towering figures in mid-century American culture, this was meant to be a collaboration with the amazing I can't find the words to describe the brilliance of her talent. The amazing dancer and choreographer, Miss Martha Graham. And the original working title of the ballet Appalachian Spring was simply Ballet for Martha. They knew that it was going to have an American theme, and they knew that the premiere would eventually take place at that exquisite little concert hall at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. Other than that, it was basically a blank page. And over the next 2 years of the ballet's creation, and Copeland working closely with Martha Graham, they developed an American story about a young pioneer couple making their house in the wilderness of Western Pennsylvania. And it was during that time that Copeland came across a poem by another of these great figures of 20th century American culture, the poet Hart Crane, in which he used the phrase Appalachian Spring. Some people say Appalachian Spring. I think it's kind of like people who are not from Missouri saying Missouri. I don't think it's done, so I always call it Appalachian Spring. But this phrase, Appalachian Spring, just leapt off the page, and that became the title of the ballet. This has led some people to think that the music is not expressing anything about the American pioneer experience, and that it's just, again, like, say, Mozart's Jupiter Symphony. It's just this work of absolute music that had a title and a story kind of imposed on it. That is also untrue, because Copeland and Martha Graham really did convey this story, again, of a young pioneer couple building their house in the Pennsylvania wilderness. The story is, again, as Copeland would have it, very straightforward, very simple. It's also, it should be said again, as part of one of these extraordinary collaborations that Copeland entered into. Martha Graham did the choreography, and the set was designed, and this was a profoundly important gesture to make in the years, well, in 1944, when the work was premiered, but the Second World War was still raging. The set for Appalachian Spring for that premiere was designed by the great Japanese-American landscape designer Isamu Noguchi, which is an amazing thought. I mean, to think in 1944, when there were still Japanese Americans living in internment camps in this country, Copeland and Graham wanted Isamu Noguchi to design the set. And it's a very famous set. There's a film, as you may know, of that original production, and Noguchi's set is so, again, simple, eloquent, and serene. The story begins with our young pioneer couple building their house. They are soon visited by an itinerant preacher who delivers to them a fiery sermon warning of the dangers of experience, shall we say. He is succeeded by an older pioneer woman who, again, choreographically conveys to the young couple her own wisdom and experience of living in the wilderness. And at the end of this 25-minute ballet, the couple stand strong and silent in their new house as they begin to make their life together in the wilderness, and they look out into the sunset, dreaming of their future together ahead of them. The work, the plot line, the music could, again, not be more simple in the best sense of that word. And of course, in that spirit, one can never forget that the penultimate section of the ballet is a set of wondrous little variations on the old Shaker hymn tune, Simple Gifts. 'Tis a gift to be simple, 'tis a gift to be free, etc. We all know the tune and the words. And the way Copeland inserts this set of symphonic variations on that again, indelibly American popular tune, the way the total subtlety with which he does this, where when it starts, you just are taken by surprise. It's the most natural thing in the world that the music would kind of come to a halt and you suddenly have this set of variations on simple gifts. This set of variations ends in a glorious peroration, and then we get the long, tranquil coda in which again our young pioneer couple are together, strong and secure and looking out into the sunset. There's nothing quite like Appalachian Spring of Mr. Aaron Copeland. Like many a masterpiece, it has come down to us in several different versions. There is a large orchestra version of the suite that was very quickly arranged by Copeland for Artur Rodzinski and the Boston Symphony Orchestra, or forgive me, it must have been the New York Philharmonic. And that is, for many years, was the most popular way to hear this work. But in 1972, Copeland's publisher published the version you're going to hear now, a suite drawn from the original scoring of the ballet for 13 players. Again, not 113 as you could do the large-scale suite, but only 13 players. A handful of strings, a flute, a clarinet, a bassoon, and a piano. And the way that this tiny group of instrumentalists are able to convey such lofty and beautiful thoughts on such a grand scale really does make this work a miracle of American music. So in celebration and in tribute to our heroes, those defending us far away, and those heroes, especially now, those heroes in our midst, we offer you Appalachian Spring of Aaron Copeland as part of this celebration of American music.